If you look back at the 17th century from a safe distance, say sitting comfortably wherever you are right now, it looks like a really neat, pivotal moment of transition.
Right, a textbook turning point.
Exactly. But if you were actually living through it in England at the time, it felt like the apocalypse.
Oh, absolutely. It was terrifying.
We aren't just talking about a political squabble or a bad election year here. We are talking about a total, messy, violent breakdown of the known order, a massive family drama that just accidentally changed the world.
Yeah, it was an existential crisis of the state.
Hmm.
You have to remember the intellectual climate that the sources from this period describe. This is the era of Thomas Hobbes.
Right, writing Leviathan.
Exactly. And for people back then, the fear wasn't just about, bad taxes or unfair policies. The real fear was a return to the state of nature, a war of all against all.
Just absolute chaos. And while the rest of Europe, like France under Louis XIV, or Prussia, or the Romanovs in Russia, while they were solving this kind of chaos by doubling down on absolutism.
Giving all the power to the king.
Right. Consolidating all power into one pair of hands, England just went completely the other way. They took this wild detour through civil war, beheadings, military dictatorship,
Like the detour.
only to eventually land on something entirely new. Constitutionalism.
It's really the great divergence of the early modern period. On the continent, the king literally became the state. But in England, the king eventually became a servant of the state.
But getting there required breaking absolutely everything first.
It did.
And that is our mission for today's deep dive. We are unpacking the historical analyses and sources, specifically looking at the AP European History Framework for this era to figure out how England moved from the divine right of kings to the rule of law.
And we need to be really clear for you as you're listening. This was not a straight line of progress.
No, not at all.
It was a brutal struggle over one main concept: sovereignty. Who actually has the final say? Is it the monarch, appointed directly by God? Or is it the people, represented by Parliament?
So let's look at the powder keg before it blew up. We have the Stuart dynasty, specifically James I and his son, Charles I.
The old regime.
Right. And the sources highlight that their conflict with Parliament wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a structural perfect storm of three specific tensions.
Ideology, economics, and religion.
Let's start with the ideology. Because we often caricature the whole divine right of kings thing as just pure royal ego.
Right, just a king wanting to do whatever he wants.
Exactly. But for James I, it was an actual sophisticated political theory. He even wrote a whole book on it.
The true law of free monarchies.
Yeah. And his argument was essentially that the king existed before the law. Therefore, the king is the source of the law. He isn't subject to it.
He sits on God's throne on earth. That's the theology of it.
Right.
Which logically means that any resistance to the king is literally a sin against God. It meant the king was infallible. If you buy that premise, the king is accountable only to God, never to the people, never to Parliament.
But, and here is the clash, this ran headfirst into the English tradition of due process.
The common law.
Right. You have Parliament and legal scholars saying, no, the law is ancient, and even the king is under the law. Charles I thought he could just seize land or property. And Parliament essentially said, not without the law, you can't.
So you have an immovable object meeting an unstoppable force. The Stuarts genuinely believed they were absolute. Parliament believed they had ancient liberty.
And that theoretical debate gets really practical the minute the king runs out of money.
Which brings us to tension number 2, economics.
The universal motivator, debt.
Always. The English crown was chronically broke from the 30 Years' War. But unlike France, England didn't have a massive standing army or a giant bureaucracy to just force people to pay new taxes.
They had to ask Parliament.
They did. Parliament held the power of the purse, and this was the lever they used. They would basically say, you want tax money? Fine, but sign this petition guaranteeing our rights first.
And Charles I famously just got totally sick of this transaction. He needed cash. They said no without concessions. So in 1629, Charles
He just ghosts them.
he ghosts them. He dissolves Parliament entirely, and he embarks on what's called the personal rule.
At the 11 Years' Tyranny.
11 years of governing without the legislature to harass him. But to do that, he had to get really creative with how he made money.
Creative is a very polite way to put it. He basically revived fiscal feudalism. He dusted off these ancient, forgotten medieval laws just to fine people. And the most controversial of these was ship money.
Yeah, this is a crucial detail in the sources. So explain ship money for us.
Originally, ship money was an emergency tax levied only on coastal towns and only during wartime to pay for the Navy.
Makes sense. They're on the coast. They need the protection.
Right. But Charles I extended it to inland towns during peacetime.
Just a blatant cash grab.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that terrified the gentry. It wasn't even about the amount of money they had to pay. It was the constitutional implication.
Because if he can do that,
If the king can tax everyone without Parliament's consent, just by declaring a permanent emergency, then Parliament literally has no reason to exist. He's stolen the power of the purse.
so the political tension is already sky high. But the spark that actually ignites the fire is the third tension, religion.
The culture war of the 17th century.
The Anglican versus Puritan beef.
Right. You have the Puritans who were gaining a lot of power in Parliament, and they wanted to purify the Church of England, strip the altars, get rid of the Catholic vibes, and focus purely on the sermon.
And Charles I did the exact opposite.
He did. He actually married a Catholic.
Yeah.
And he and his Archbishop, William Laud, pushed for a church that emphasized ritual, hierarchy, the beauty of holiness.
Which alienated the exact people he needed to govern. And they were politically tone-deaf about it. They didn't just force this on England. They tried to force the Anglican prayer book on Scotland in 1637.
Which went about as well as you'd expect.
The Scots rioted.
They rioted, signed a national covenant, and raised an army. And that is the breaking point. That is checkmate for Charles.
Because he needs an army to fight the Scots.
Right. He can't pay for an army without taxes.
Right.
And he can't get taxes without Parliament. So after 11 years of ignoring them, he is forced to call Parliament back.
Which leads to the short Parliament, which he dismissed almost immediately because they were mad, and then the long Parliament, which refused to go home.
They didn't just come back to sign a check, they came back for blood.
Yeah.
They executed Charles's top advisors. They passed a law saying the king couldn't dissolve them without their consent.
The trust was just completely gone.
Yeah.
By 1642, Charles actually attempts to arrest 5 members of Parliament. He marches into the House of Commons, violating its sanctity, and fails to find them.
He has to flee London. And it's war.
The English Civil War. So let's look at the sides here. You have the Royalists, right? The Cavaliers.
The fancy nobility, mostly from the north of England. They had the cavalry. The initial assumption was actually that the king would win easily.
But Parliament had the parliamentarians, the Roundheads, they had the resources of London, they had the Navy.
And they had a massive innovation, the new model army.
The sources spend a lot of time on this. This wasn't just your standard gathering of local peasants forced to fight for their lord.
No, it was a professional fighting force. It was meritocratic, which was entirely revolutionary for the time. But more importantly, it was ideologically driven.
The Puritans.
Right, especially Oliver Cromwell's regiments. They truly believed they were fighting the Lord's battles. And that kind of morale is just a massive force multiplier.
So they crush the Royalists. We hit the climax in 1649. Charles I isn't just defeated, he is captured. Now, normally in history, this is where the war ends, right? The king loses some power, signs a treaty, and stays on the throne.
And that is exactly what the moderate majority in Parliament wanted to do. They were terrified of the radicalism spreading in the army. They just wanted a settlement.
But Charles wouldn't play ball.
He was completely duplicitous. He refused to negotiate in good faith. He even managed to spark a second civil war while he was in captivity.
And that is the turning point for Oliver Cromwell and the radical army leadership. They realized Charles is never going to stop.
They called him a man of blood. They concluded that as long as he was breeding, he would be a rallying point for endless civil war.
But you can't just put a king on trial. Legally, the king is the source of justice. He owns the courts. How do you try him?
Well, the army had a solution for that. Brute force.
Pride's purge.
Exactly. Oliver Cromwell essentially has to purge Parliament of anyone who disagrees with him first. Colonel Thomas Pride literally stands at the door of the House of Commons and physically blocks the moderates from entering.
Creating what they called the Rump Parliament. So the body that eventually puts the king on trial isn't actually a representative parliament at all.
No, it's a revolutionary tribunal.
And the trial itself is incredible legal theater. They find the king guilty of treason and execute him.
We really have to emphasize the gravity of this moment. A reigning monarch was legally tried and killed by his own people.
On January 30th, 1649, they take him out onto the scaffold, the axe falls, and it permanently ends the era of personal rule.
It was a collective psychological trauma for the nation. They killed the Lord's anointed, and now they were staring into the void.
So the king is dead, Monarchy is abolished. Is England a free, happy democracy now?
Absolutely not.
They declared a republic, right? The Commonwealth.
They did. They called it the Protectorate. But it was a complete sham. And this brings us to the great irony of Oliver Cromwell.
Let's unpack that, because Parliament fought a bloody war to stop a king from ruling without them.
Right. And what does Cromwell do? Once he's in power, the Rump Parliament becomes unpopular. So Cromwell literally marches in with musketeers and dissolves Parliament himself.
He does exactly what Charles I did.
Exactly. He rules as Lord Protector, which is basically a military dictator for a decade.
There is a really dark humor in that. Trading a king who claimed divine right for a general who rules entirely by military force.
He instituted the rule of the major generals. It was martial law. They policed morality, closed alehouses, suppressed dissent. It proved that a republic without a true foundation of legitimacy just rests on the sword.
So when Cromwell dies in 1658, the whole thing just collapses.
His son tries to take over but can't hold it together. The country is exhausted.
So England effectively says, okay, well, that didn't work. Let's just bring back the king.
The Restoration of 1660. They invite Charles II, the executed king's son, back to the throne.
And Charles II is tricky. He's smart enough not to poke the bear.
Right, he acts like the last 20 years just didn't happen.
But the cycle repeats itself. Because when Charles II dies, his brother takes over, James II. And according to the sources, he was a disaster for Parliament.
A complete disaster.
Okay.
He had none of his brother's political instincts. He was openly Catholic in a fiercely Protestant country, and he was a full-on absolutist.
The fears of the 1630s just came rushing back.
He started appointing Catholics to power, which was illegal. He used his royal powers to just nullify laws he didn't like.
So Parliament decides they need to fire the king. But peacefully this time. No civil wars.
Right. In 1688, they orchestrate the Glorious Revolution.
They write a letter to James II's daughter, Mary, who is Protestant, and her husband, William of Orange. And they basically invite them to invade England.
And William does. He lands with a massive Dutch army. James II's support just evaporates, and he flees to France.
It's often called the bloodless coup.
Though we should clarify, it was only really bloodless in England. It was quite bloody in Ireland and Scotland. But in terms of the English throne, James was gone.
But here is the crucial difference from the Restoration. William and Mary could only take the throne if they signed a contract.
The deal. The English Bill of Rights of 1689.
This is the moment the divine right officially dies. What were the key provisions they had to agree to?
The Bill of Rights established that the king absolutely cannot annul or suspend laws. Only Parliament can raise taxes, and it established parliamentary sovereignty.
The king is now effectively an employee of the Constitution.
Exactly. They even passed the Mutiny Act, which is a brilliant little mechanical check on power.
How did that work?
It authorized army discipline, so the ability to have a standing army, but only for 1 year at a time.
Oh, wow.
Right. So if the monarch didn't call Parliament into session every single year to renew that act, the army would technically become illegal and have to disband.
That forces the king to work with Parliament constantly, not just when he's broke.
It ensured the monarch could never govern alone again.
So, to summarize this incredible journey we've been on, we went from the absolutism of James I straight into a brutal civil war, detoured into Cromwell's dictatorship, and finally landed on a constitutional monarchy.
It's a chaotic century.
It really is. But for you listening, why should you care about a bunch of 17th century political maneuvering?
Because this created the modern model of the rule of law. It ensured that the gentry and the aristocracy actually had a permanent voice.
It set the stage for modern democracy, even though it wasn't a democracy yet.
Not at all. It was an oligarchy of the wealthy. But the machinery of debate, of checking executive power, of requiring consent for taxation, that was all locked into place here.
It's the foundation. But it leaves us with a really provocative thought to chew on, especially when you look at the irony of Oliver Cromwell.
The dictator who replaced the tyrant.
Exactly. When a society overthrows a tyrant like Charles I, why is it so incredibly hard to avoid replacing them with just a different kind of dictator?
Is the vacuum of power actually more dangerous than the tyrant itself?
It's something to think about. Tearing down the system is the easy part. Building a legitimate one that doesn't just rely on the sword, that's the real challenge.
Absolutely.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the sources on the English path to constitutionalism. Thanks for exploring the chaos with us.
Always a pleasure.
Keep questioning the history you read, and we'll catch you on the next one.